So, this crazy thing happened to me back in the summer of 2020. Remember how the world was basically on pause because of the whole COVID situation? Everyone was stuck inside going stir crazy. Well, I'm a big fan of backpacking and camping, so I used the whole lockdown thing as a reason to explore some national parks. One of my stops was this awesome creek in Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. Now, without getting into too many personal details, let's just say I had some issues at my old job back in late 19. Let's just say my reputation took a bit of a hit. A lot of people were seriously ticked off at me. I ended up having to move apartments, change my phone number, the whole 9 yards. I'd made a pretty big mistake that cost some folks a chunk of change, so the backlash wasn't exactly a surprise. I just didn't expect it to go as far as it did. I was getting bombarded with harassing texts from all sorts of random numbers for a while there. Some of them were downright threatening. I couldn't tell if it was the same person using different numbers or a whole bunch of different people, but the thought of one person behind it all was definitely unsettling. Eventually, it seemed to die down, and I was just relieved that whoever it was seemed to have lost interest. Around that time, I was taking some time off work, another reason I was hitting up all these national parks. I drove the 3 hours out to Rocky Mountain, parked my trusty pickup, and started hiking up the trail to the creek. It was totally deserted. I figured it was a combination of the early lockdown and the fact that it was still late spring. There was a thin layer of crunchy snow on the ground, making a satisfying snap, crackle, pop with every step. After a bit of a hike, I finally reached the creek. It was flowing strong, not frozen at all. It was so peaceful, exactly the kind of escape I needed from all the stress I'd been dealing with. I found a secluded spot a little ways off the trail and set up camp. Got the tent pitched, chopped some firewood, got a nice little fire going, and cooked up some brats on my camp stove. Perfect. I settled in by the fire with my book. After a few chapters, the sun started to dip below the horizon. Thank goodness for headlamps, right? I decided to light up a joint and chill for a bit. A few puffs in, my phone starts buzzing like crazy. I usually don't get a ton of texts besides from my family, so I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket and saw a bunch of messages from an unknown number. My heart did a little jump when I realized it was happening again. The texts were from a number with a 203 area code, Connecticut. Whoever it was texted, "How's your camping trip going, buddy?" Then, "It's beautiful out here." And then, "I see why you came up here." My first instinct was to text back, "Who is this?" If they just left it at the first message, I might have thought it was my cousin Mike messing with me. But these messages were like, they were right there with me. The weed was definitely kicking in by now, and that did not help my anxiety. I got super paranoid and started looking around, doing a full 360, scanning the darkening woods. I grabbed my trusty Smith & Wesson from my backpack, just to feel a little safer. Usually, I'd put out the fire before turning in for the night, but I was too freaked out to be in complete darkness. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight, staring at my phone, waiting for a reply that never came. The minutes ticked by, and I just wanted the high to wear off. I tried to read my book with my headlamp on, but between being high and obsessing over those texts, it was pointless. I decided to watch some YouTube videos to kill time. I was watching some true crime doc. Great choice, right? When I suddenly got another text, a response to my "Who is this?" It just said, "Doesn't matter anymore." My heart started pounding again. I texted back, "How did you know I'm camping?" But again, no response. The anxiety was really getting to me now. Was this a prank by my buddy, Steve? Or was it the same creep who'd been harassing me before? But if it was them, how on earth did they know I was camping? That was the really unsettling part. I managed to waste another hour watching videos, and I noticed the fire outside was dying down. In the winter woods, it's dead silent, except maybe for the wind. The second the video stopped, the silence was deafening. I usually love that kind of quiet, but not this time. Then, the silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the snow. They got closer and closer to my tent, stopping just a few feet away. I gripped my gun tightly, ready to take off the safety. Suddenly, there was a flash of light from outside, like someone had shined a flashlight at the tent or taken a picture. Then I heard the person walk away, the footsteps fading into the distance. And just like I'd been dreading, my phone buzzed. It was a photo from that number. A picture of my tent. And then a text, "Have a good night's sleep." Something just snapped in me. The rest of the hide just vanished, replaced by a rush of adrenaline. I unzipped the tent and fired 2 shots into the air. I heard footsteps running away in the distance, which meant they were still out there somewhere, watching. I yelled a threat into the night and scrambled back into my tent. It seemed to work because there were no more texts or sounds. I was wide awake for hours, like I'd chugged a pot of coffee. Eventually I crashed, and waking up to the morning sun was a huge relief. Whoever had followed me wasn't expecting me to be armed. I'm definitely not the type of person you'd expect to own a gun, and that was actually the first time I'd ever fired it. Whoever had been texting me, harassing me, and apparently stalking me clearly decided to back off when they realized I had a gun. It's been a few years now, and I haven't heard a peep from them. But man, that was one seriously messed up night. I can't even imagine how it might have ended if I hadn't been armed. It was the summer after I graduated high school, and my friends and I, eager to celebrate our newfound freedom, planned a week-long camping trip in the Black Hills of South Dakota. We were drawn to the area by its rugged beauty and the promise of adventure, especially the chance to explore Wind Cave National Park. We'd heard stories of its vast network of underground passages and the strange air currents that gave it its name. We arrived at the park campground on a sweltering July afternoon. The sun beat down on the dry, dusty landscape, and the air was thick with the scent of pine needles and dry earth. We set up our tents in a secluded spot near the edge of the campground, eager to distance ourselves from the other families and RVs. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, a cool breeze swept through the trees, bringing with it a welcome respite from the heat. Our first few days were idyllic. We hiked through the park's scenic trails, marveling at the towering rock formations and the sweeping views of the surrounding plains. We spent hours exploring the above-ground parts of Wind Cave, fascinated by the boxwork formations and the mysterious drafts that emanated from the cave's mouth. We even took a ranger-led tour of the cave, descending into its depths and learning about its geological history. It was on the 3rd night that things took a turn. We had returned to our campsite after a long day of hiking, built a campfire, and cooked our dinner. As the darkness deepened, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees and creating an eerie atmosphere. We sat around the fire, telling stories and laughing, trying to ignore the growing unease that seemed to settle over the campsite. Around midnight, as we were preparing to turn in for the night, we heard a sound that made us all freeze. It was a faint whisper carried on the wind, seemingly coming from the direction of the cave. At first, we dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on our ears. But then it came again, louder this time, a distinct murmur of voices too regular to be the wind. We exchanged nervous glances, our laughter replaced by a chilling silence. We strained our ears, trying to decipher the whispers, but they were too indistinct, too muffled, as if the voices were coming from deep underground. The wind continued to howl, and the whispers grew more insistent, creating a cacophony of sound that filled the night air. My friend Mark, ever the daredevil, suggested we investigate. The rest of us were hesitant, but the combination of youthful bravado and a touch of morbid curiosity eventually won out. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously made our way towards the cave entrance, the whispers growing louder with each step. As we approached the cave mouth, the wind intensified, swirling around us and carrying the whispers with it. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over us. We shone our flashlights into the darkness of the cave, but the beams were swallowed by the inky blackness. Suddenly, we heard a distinct voice, clear and close, as if someone was standing right beside us. It was a woman's voice, whispering our names one by one. We all jumped back, our hearts pounding in our chests. We shone our flashlights around, but there was no one there. The voice had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Terrified, we turned and ran back to our campsite, not stopping until we were safely inside our tents. We didn't sleep much that night, the whispers continuing to haunt our dreams. The next morning, we packed up our camp and left the Black Hills, vowing never to return. To this day, we don't know what we heard that night. We've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away as the wind or our imaginations. But the memory of the whispers, the chilling voice calling our names, remains vivid and unsettling. We've since learned about Native American legends associated with Wind Cave, stories of spirits and underground beings. While we can't say for sure what we experienced, the whispers in the wind remain a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lie hidden beneath the surface of the earth. My grandfather, a man of few words and even fewer smiles, owned a small, dilapidated cabin deep within the cypress swamps of Louisiana. It wasn't much, just a single room with a tin roof, built on stilts to keep it above the murky water. He used it for fishing and hunting, venturing into the swamp for weeks at a time, returning with tales of monstrous catfish and elusive deer. As a child, I was both fascinated and terrified by his stories, especially the ones he told around the campfire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. One sweltering summer, when I was about 16, my grandfather invited me to join him on one of his expeditions. I was hesitant, but the allure of the unknown, the promise of adventure in the mysterious swamp, was too strong to resist. We drove for hours, deeper and deeper into the Louisiana backwoods, until we reached a narrow, overgrown dirt road. The road twisted and turned through dense vegetation, the air thick with humidity and the buzz of insects. Finally, we arrived at a small clearing where the cabin stood, its weathered wood blending seamlessly with the surrounding trees. The swamp was a world of its own. The air was heavy with the smell of decaying vegetation and stagnant water. The silence was broken only by the croaking of frogs, the buzzing of mosquitoes, and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the dark water. The cypress trees, draped with Spanish moss, stood like ghostly sentinels, their gnarled roots submerged in the black water. The first few days were uneventful. We fished in the murky water, catching a few small catfish and sunfish. My grandfather taught me how to identify different types of plants and animal tracks, sharing his vast knowledge of the swamp. But as the days passed, a sense of unease began to creep in. One night, as we sat by the campfire, my grandfather told me a story about the swamp. He spoke of a creature, a legend whispered among the locals, a being said to inhabit the deepest parts of the swamp. They called it the night fisher, a creature neither man nor beast, with glowing red eyes and a haunting cry that could curdle blood. I dismissed it as an old wives' tale, but my grandfather's serious expression made me wonder. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind rustled through the cypress trees, creating eerie shadows that danced on the cabin walls. I kept hearing strange noises outside, splashes in the water, rustling in the underbrush, and a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the depths of the swamp. Then, around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a cry, a long, drawn-out wail that echoed through the swamp. It sounded like nothing I had ever heard before, a mix of animal and human, filled with a primal fear that resonated deep within my soul. I sat up in my cot, my heart pounding in my chest. My grandfather, who had been sleeping soundly, was now awake, his eyes wide with fear. He grabbed his shotgun, his hand trembling slightly. The cry came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something heavy, moving through the water, crashing against the cypress knees. We both held our breath, listening intently. The sounds continued, circling the cabin, drawing closer and closer. Suddenly, there was a loud bang against the cabin wall, shaking the entire structure. We both jumped, our eyes fixed on the spot where the sound had come from. We could hear something scraping against the wood, its nails or claws digging into the rough surface. My grandfather raised his shotgun, his finger on the trigger. We waited in terrified silence, the only sound the pounding of our hearts and the scraping against the cabin wall. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The swamp was silent once more, the only sound the gentle lapping of the water against the stilts. We stayed awake for the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep. As soon as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up our belongings and left the cabin, not stopping until we were far away from the swamp. We never spoke of what we heard that night, but the memory of the cry, the scraping, and the overwhelming sense of dread remains etched in my mind. I never went back to the cabin with my grandfather, and he never mentioned the night fisher again. But I know deep down that something was out there in the swamp that night, something that defied explanation, something that still haunts my dreams. We hope you enjoyed this journey into the unknown. We'd also love to hear your thoughts, so please feel free to leave a comment below and let us know what you think. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, we'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. It helps us create more content that we think you'll love. And if you know someone who enjoys a good mystery or spooky story, please share this video with them. Thank you so much for your support.